On the morning of October 4th, 1971, 143 workers showed up for their regular shift at Continental Motor Works exactly the way they had every single weekday for the last 16 years and found the front gates padlocked from the inside. Not late, not delayed, locked, with the machines still warm from being shut down sometime overnight, coffee cups still sitting half full on workbenches, and a single handwritten note pinned to the gate that read, "Only closed. I'm sorry. No warning, no meeting, no severance." The man who had built that factory from nothing, who had shaken every single one of their hands personally on their first day of work, had simply vanished sometime between midnight and dawn, and he would never set foot in that town again for the rest of his life. For 50 years, the town told itself a story about what happened that night, and almost none of it, as it turns out, was true. To understand why an entire factory could disappear overnight, you first have to understand what Continental Motor Works actually meant to the small New England town of Ashford Falls. Founded in 1955 by a stubborn, self-taught engineer named Harold Whitfield, everyone just called him Hal. The factory started out as little more than a converted mill building, and a handful of men who believed they could build something worth riding. By the mid-1960s, Continental Motorcycles had built a genuine reputation among riders who valued handling and reliability over flashy marketing, the kind of company motorcyclists actually trusted, and the factory itself had grown to employ nearly a third of the working adults in Ashford Falls. Fathers worked there. Then their sons worked there. It wasn't just a job in that town. It was the entire town's identity, stitched into the fabric of every family for 2 generations. Hal Whitfield himself was the kind of boss who walked the factory floor every single morning, who knew every employee's name and most of their kids' names too, who ate lunch in the same cafeteria as the assembly line workers instead of some private office upstairs. He wasn't just running a business. He had built something closer to a family, and everyone in Ashford Falls, right up until that morning in October, genuinely believed he would run that factory until the day he died. So when the gates stayed locked, and Hal Whitfield was nowhere to be found, and the only explanation anyone ever got was 2 handwritten sentences pinned to a fence, the town needed a story to make sense of it. And in the absence of the truth, people filled that silence with the worst assumptions imaginable. Rumors spread within days that Hal had gambled the company into ruin. Others whispered that he'd embezzled everything and fled the country. A few even claimed, without a shred of evidence, that organized crime had gotten involved in the business somehow, and Hal had simply run for his life. None of it was ever confirmed. None of it needed to be, because Hal Whitfield never came back to defend himself, not once, not even years later, when a handful of loyal former employees tracked down an address for him 2 states away and wrote letters. He apparently never answered. He died in 1994, alone, in a small rented room above a hardware store, 300 miles from Ashford Falls, and the local paper in that town ran a 4-sentence obituary that didn't even mention the factory he'd spent his entire adult life building. As far as almost everyone was concerned, Hal Whitfield was simply the man who destroyed Ashford Falls and then ran away from what he'd done. That is the story the town believed for nearly 50 years, and it is almost entirely wrong. The truth started coming apart in 2021 when Hal's great-niece, a museum archivist named Claire Whitfield, who had grown up hearing only vague, embarrassed mentions of her disgraced great-uncle at family gatherings, was contacted by a local historical society, putting together a small exhibit on Ashford Falls's manufacturing history. They asked if her family had any old records or photographs from the factory. Mostly out of curiosity about a relative, nobody in her family had ever actually explained properly. She agreed to look, and what she eventually found in a storage unit, her own grandmother had quietly paid for decades without telling anyone. Why would completely rewrite everything the town thought it knew? Inside that unit were dozens of cardboard boxes filled with ledgers, receipts, and correspondence, meticulously organized the exact same obsessive way Hal apparently ran everything in his life. And buried in the middle of them, Claire found a single folder labeled only with a date, September 1971, 3 weeks before the factory closed. Inside that folder was an internal engineering report, one that had clearly never been shared with anyone outside a tiny circle at the company, documenting a metallurgical flaw discovered in a batch of frame welds produced that summer. A defect that under specific stress conditions could cause a catastrophic frame failure at speed. And clipped to that report was a second document that made Claire's stomach drop the moment she understood what she was reading. It was an incident report for a young test rider named Sam Delgado, 23 years old, one of Hal's own apprentices, someone the ledgers made clear Hal had essentially treated like the son he never had. Older employees interviewed for the exhibit still remembered Sam clearly, a local kid who'd started sweeping floors at Continental at 16 and worked his way up through sheer stubbornness until Hal personally pulled him onto the small experimental team, teaching him everything himself, staying late most nights to walk him through engine tolerances and frame geometry like a father passing down a trade. Hal had no children of his own. By every account from people who worked there, Sam had quietly become the closest thing to one he ever had, and Hal made no secret of the fact that he expected Sam to eventually run the experimental department himself one day. Sam died in a testing accident on September 28, 1971, 6 days before the factory closed, riding a prototype built from that exact flawed batch of frames. But the report didn't stop there. It included something far worse. A shipping manifest showing that roughly 400 motorcycles built from that same compromised batch had already been sold and delivered to dealerships across 11 states in the weeks before Sam's accident. Somewhere out there, right at that moment, hundreds of ordinary riders were driving motorcycles with the exact same hidden defect that had just killed a young man Hal loved like family, and almost nobody at the company, besides Hal himself and a couple of senior engineers, even knew it yet. This is where the story most people in Ashford Falls had told for 50 years completely falls apart, because what Hal Whitfield actually did next was not the act of a coward running from responsibility. It was very nearly the opposite. A full public recall, the kind any modern manufacturer would be legally required to issue today, would have instantly destroyed Continental Motor Works. The company simply did not have the capital to survive the cost of recalling and replacing 400 motorcycles, on top of the lawsuits that would inevitably follow once the defect became public. Hal understood immediately that announcing the truth meant bankruptcy, the end of every job in that building, and very likely the end of the only identity Ashford Falls had ever known for 2 generations. He also understood that staying silent and continuing to sell that inventory meant more riders were going to die exactly the way Sam had. According to the ledgers Claire found, spanning literally decades of entries in his own increasingly shaky handwriting, Hal chose a third option that nobody in his life ever knew about. He shut the factory down completely overnight, immediately, before a single additional flawed motorcycle could leave the building, sacrificing the company, the jobs, and his own reputation in a single stroke, rather than risk one more, Sam Delgado. And then, using every dollar of his personal savings, and eventually the proceeds from selling nearly everything he owned, he spent the rest of his life quietly and anonymously tracking down and buying back as many of those 400 motorcycles as he possibly could, one at a time, under a false name, working a series of ordinary mechanic jobs just to fund it, driving from state to state to knock on strangers' doors with a story about being a collector willing to pay generously for exactly that model and year. The ledgers documented 167 motorcycles he personally tracked down and permanently destroyed over the following 23 years. Tucked among the receipts were letters, some from the very owners he'd bought bikes from, thanking a mysterious buyer for such a generous, if slightly strange, offer, with absolutely no idea what they had actually just been saved from. He never told anyone in Ashford Falls the truth. He let an entire town believe he was a coward, a thief, possibly even a criminal, rather than risk the company's remaining assets in a lawsuit that public knowledge of the defect would have guaranteed, and rather than ever have to explain that the boy he loved like a son was already gone and he still couldn't save every rider out there in time. He died believing he'd only managed to find and destroy a little less than half of the flawed bikes he knew were still out there somewhere, his life's final unfinished obligation. Claire sat in that storage unit for hours after finding the last ledger entry, dated just months before Hal's death, still meticulously logging serial numbers of motorcycles he was still hunting down at 79 years old, with almost nothing left to his name. She thought about every family gathering where her great-uncle's name had been mentioned only in hushed, embarrassed tones, every assumption the entire town had comfortably settled into for 50 years, because the truth was simply never available to correct it. When the Historical Society's exhibit finally opened, it wasn't the celebration of small-town manufacturing history they had originally planned. It became something else entirely, a public reckoning with a man Ashford Falls had spent half a century quietly despising for a decision that had actually cost him everything he had specifically to protect strangers he would never meet. Surviving former employees, now elderly themselves, stood in front of display cases holding Hal's actual ledgers, with tears running down their faces, finally understanding that the man who supposedly abandoned them had in fact spent the rest of his life alone, broke, and unrecognized, still trying to finish a promise none of them ever knew he'd made. The factory that vanished overnight in 1971 didn't disappear because one man destroyed everything he'd built out of greed or cowardice. It disappeared because, faced with an impossible choice between his own legacy and the lives of strangers he would never meet, Hal Whitfield chose the harder, lonelier, completely unrewarded path and simply let the world believe whatever it wanted about him for the rest of his life, rather than explain himself. Ashford Falls eventually renamed a small stretch of road near the old factory building after him, a modest gesture, decades too late for Hal himself to ever see it, but one that finally corrected 50 years of a story the town had gotten completely wrong. Somewhere, in a collection Claire is still slowly trying to complete, there remain a handful of those original flawed motorcycles Hal never got the chance to track down himself, still out there in barns and collections across the country, riders completely unaware of the quiet, decades-long promise one broken-hearted old man made to a boy he loved like a son and very nearly kept alone. If a story like this one lands the way it landed on me while researching it, then you already understand exactly why some of the most important stories in motorcycle history were never actually about the motorcycles themselves. They were about the people willing to lose everything, including their own good name, rather than let anyone else get hurt. Stick around, because there are more stories like Hal Whitfield's buried in old ledgers and storage units all across this country, waiting for someone to finally open the right box, and I intend to keep finding them.